In this video, we're going to look at why people say the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, is considered to be a wooden translation. Now, in this video, when I talk about the NASB and I use the adjective wooden, I don't mean that to be a put down or some sort of a major criticism. There is a downside to being very literal, but there's also an upside, and we're going to see that as we look at an example that I wanted to give. And that's all I want to do in this video, is just show you one example of what people mean when they say the New American Standard Bible is wooden. People question that sometimes. They say, I've read the NASB and I don't find it to be wooden at all. And I think it's because of a misunderstanding of what that word means. Some people are expecting that when they read the NASB, there's going to be something about it that just makes it extremely awkward. And that's not really what I think most of us are saying when we say it's wooden. We're just saying it's a little bit more on that literal side, to the extent that there are phrases that you'll read in the NASB that you wouldn't typically hear when you speak or read English. So I'm going to give you an example from Romans chapter 12, and I want to see if you can pick up on what I would consider to be something in this passage. It's just very small. It's easy to overlook, actually, but it is what I would call a wooden translation, if you will. So let me read the first few verses from Romans 12, starting in verse 14. It says, "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation." Now, see if you can look at those verses and see if anything at all jumps out at you as being wooden, or being a phrase that we just typically wouldn't say in English. And I have to be honest, this is something that's very subtle. It's not even something that I would have necessarily noticed myself, but because I was comparing it to other translations, it did jump out at me that, yeah, this would be an example, and there are many others you could look at. And it's very subtle, but it's an example of what you might call a more wooden translation. So what I'm referring to is actually here in verse 16. It says, "Be of the same mind toward one another," which to me, that seems totally normal. But then it says, "Do not be haughty in mind." And that phrase, haughty in mind, is what I was referring to here. It's just not a phrase that you would typically hear in English. So let's compare that to the English Standard Version. And what you see here is that in the English Standard Version, it says, "Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty." And that is a phrase that we would use typically in English. Now, I don't hear the word haughty that much in speech in English, but I do think that if you're going to write this phrase, this is much more typical to just say, "Do not be haughty," rather than "Do not be haughty in mind." Now, I think we could argue as to the merits, the things that are good, or the downside of each of these approaches to translation. But I wanted to explain to people who are confused as to why anyone would say the NASB is wooden, this is the reason. Because it has these phrases here, and this is not going to surprise you. If you look in the Greek, I have here on the left is the English, "Be of the same mind toward one another." And the word for mind there is phroneo. That's the root word. And then if you go a little further down, it says, "Do not be haughty in mind," and there you have that same root word again. So one way you could actually translate this whole phrase here, or these phrases here, is to say, "Be same-minded, not high-minded." That's kind of what's being said here. Have a unity of mind rather than pride of mind. So there is a correlation here. Paul is using the same word 2 times. So you do get that in the NASB. "Be of the same mind, do not be haughty in mind." And that really does reflect the Greek to some degree. And you do miss that a little bit in the English Standard Version. On the other hand, in the English Standard Version, if an English person is reading that or listening to that, it sounds very natural. "Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty." So this is definitely a looser translation on this particular verse, but it's very clear and very natural. So you kind of see the differences and really the advantages of each approach to translation. For study, this is just me personally, I like something like the NASB that's very literal, so I can see some of the wording in the original language coming out in this translation. On the other hand, if I'm reading to people or I'm teaching, especially people that are not as familiar with the Bible, this in the ESV comes across very beautifully and clearly. And that clarity has something that I think is to be commended. It's actually something very useful when you're teaching people, that when you first read something, it's really hitting home in a clear way. Now, another thing that I wanted to add to this discussion is actually a comment that I read yesterday. It said on one of my videos, "I am not a native English speaker, but when I read NASB Bible, somehow it is speaking the most to me." And I find that to be a really interesting phenomenon, and a lot of people will point this out, that, you know, the NASB to them is actually very clear, but why is it that a non-native English speaker would find the NASB to be clear if it's a wooden translation? And I actually think there's a good explanation for that, similar to the King James Version. Believe it or not, a lot of times it's easier for someone who is a little bit less familiar with English, or I should say someone who didn't start out with English, to read something like the King James Version rather than a very contemporary person who's never read that kind of English in the King James. Because a native English speaker is going to be more sensitive to phrases that are unusual, that are what they're not used to hearing. They're going to pick up on those things a lot more. Whereas a non-native English speaker, I think, is going to have less sensitivity to things that would sound maybe unusual when you read that in English if you're a native English speaker. So they're going to be less sensitive to anything that's unusual, and they're going to, I think, have more flexibility as to how they perceive the English language. Therefore, getting back to the NASB, when a non-native English speaker reads, "Be of the same mind toward one another, do not be haughty in mind," I think for a lot of people that English is not their first language, nothing really sounds all that abnormal or strange. And let's face it, even a lot of English speakers wouldn't pick up on that. But when you compare that to the English Standard Version, those of you who are native English speakers, I think you would agree, live in harmony with one another, do not be haughty. That is more the way we would speak. That is more natural to us who are native speakers and writers. So that's a little explanation and example of what we mean when people say the New American Standard Bible is wooden. And again, some of these things are actually very subtle, and a lot of people don't pick up on it, or they don't think it's a problem when they read. They think it actually sounds quite natural and very easy to understand. So some of this just comes down to what you're used to and what your starting point is. If you read the New American Standard Bible a lot, I'm sure you get really used to it. That's true really with any translation that you use. However, as someone who's looked at a lot of different translations, I do think that, as objectively as I can look at this, the New American Standard Bible does sometimes have kind of a wooden quality to it. I think it's much improved over what it was originally updating, which is the American Standard Version, which I think pretty much is universally agreed to be a quite wooden translation, whereas the New American Standard Bible is not nearly as wooden. But let me show you one other thing. If you want to talk about wooden, this would be a very wooden translation. If we go back here to the interlinear, I'm actually going to put the interlinear here for this verse in the order of the Greek. So now the Greek words on the left here are in the order that you actually see them in the original writing. And what you'll see on the right here are the English equivalents, as best as we can do in English, in the same order as the original. So this is a truly wooden translation of Romans 12:16. Same toward one another, be of the mind. Do not be haughty in mind, but with the lowly associate. Do not be wise in your own estimation. So you can understand that to some degree but that is clearly not natural English at all. The New American Standard Bible in some ways does reflect the Greek, but definitely not to that degree. It's not that wooden. The only way you can really pick up on it is if you're really looking closely and you see a phrase like this, haughty in mind. And again, there's an advantage in some way because you actually see the correlation be of the same mind, not haughty in mind. So you see that connection. On the other hand, it's not as beautiful, in my opinion, or as clear as other renderings like the ESV, live in harmony with one another, do not be haughty. So talking about all of this is not really to disparage or promote any particular translation. It's really just to present this to you so that you kind of see examples of how different translations read. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about the NASB being wooden because I just happened to read this in Romans 12 as I was looking at different translations, and I thought, wow, this would be a good example to share with people. Let me know in the comments if you found this to be helpful, if you understand what I'm saying here. Do you think the NASB is wooden? Do you find that to be the case? What are some other examples of woodenness that you've seen? Or are you someone who would say, no, the NASB reads very naturally to me? It'd be interesting to hear your feedback in the comment section, but thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts on this subject, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.